Greetings everyone, I am a PhD candidate at Illinois Institute of Technology, Chicago. Today I'll be talking about my work called DLIO, a data-centric benchmark for scientific deep learning applications. Scientists utilize deep learning methods to reduce computation complexity in their applications. It is used in a variety of domains such as material science, biology, particle physics, and many more as shown on the right. Efficient ingestion and processing of data is crucial for the efficiency of deep learning methods as seen often in cloud environments. However, the data characteristics of deep learning methods in these scientific domains is not well understood. Popular deep learning frameworks such as TensorFlow, PyTorch, and Caffe provide infrastructure to optimize data management required by deep learning methods. In general, the data management in any deep learning technique has three phases. Data ingestion, that is, how the data is read from several sources into memory for input processing. Data preprocessing, that is, what data operators are applied in memory on the data before feeding it to the training loop. And finally, data communication, how data exchange occurs between workers of the deep learning training framework. These phases have their own software and hardware optimizations supported by modern deep learning frameworks. In this work, we observe the lack of understanding of I/O behavior of deep learning applications running at scale. Therefore, we aim to systematically characterize various deep learning applications and build a representative benchmark to enable I/O research for improving efficiency of deep learning applications in these environments. To this end, we present DLIO, a data-centric benchmark for scientific DL application. This code is publicly available at my GitHub repo. To achieve a representative benchmark, we need to first understand the I/O behavior of scientific deep learning applications. As a use case, we use applications present in Argonne Leadership Computing Facility from various current projects. For this study, we utilize the production supercomputer at ALCF, Theta. All applications are part of ongoing projects in Argonne targeted towards the next exascale era, such as Argonne Data Science Program, Aurora Early Science Program, and exascale computing projects. These applications are run with 128 night landing nodes over Lustre file system, which has a peak bandwidth of 240 gigabytes per second. All these applications are written with TensorFlow framework. Therefore, we utilize its internal profiler along with low-level I/O profiling using Darshan. Finally, we built an analysis tool for combining the high-level details from the TensorFlow profiler with the low-level I/O profiling from Darshan to provide us with an holistic view of the I/O behavior of each of these applications. In this work, we looked at 8 applications as described before. Let's look into each of these applications on their high-level goal and their dataset features. First, we have the neutrino and cosmic tagging with unit application, which is also called as cosmic tagger. This application uses deep learning to separate cosmic pixels, background pixels, and neutrino pixels within the images. The application has a 33 gigabyte dataset containing 43,000 samples stored in one large HDF5 file, with each sample with an average size of 40 kilobytes. The deep learning model itself runs over 150 steps with a batch size of 32 images. Next is the distributed version of the flood filling networks implemented again in TensorFlow. In this application, the deep learning model segments a brain tissue image into complex and large shapes of neurons. The application has a 2.3 gigabyte dataset with 19,000 samples, each of size 32 kilobytes. The deep learning model trains on this dataset over 150 steps with a batch size of 32 sample images. The next application is the Cosmo Flow benchmark, which is used for studying the features in the distribution of dark matter in the universe. This application is written in TensorFlow with a 2 terabyte dataset in TF record format. The dataset consists of 256 samples spread across 1024 TF record files. Finally, the training runs over 256K steps with one image per training step. Next, we have the Cancer Distributed Learning Environment project, also known as CANDLE. The application classifies RNA sequence gene to detect normal or tumor tissue in the image. It has 700 datasets of 1120 records, with each record size of 256 kilobyte. The dataset is stored and read using CSV format. The deep learning model trains using the entire dataset over 60 epochs with a batch size of 20 records. Next, the Fusion Recurrent Neural Net is the application that predicts the disruption in fusion plasmas. The application consists of a 6 GB dataset in NPZ or NumPy array files format, distributed across 2 MB files, each containing 1000 samples. The training model uses 100 estimates with a batch size of 500 samples. Next, we have the ImageNet benchmark modified to run over Theta supercomputer at ALCF. It is an image classification application which uses popular convolutional models such as ResNet 50 and AlexNet. The benchmark itself consists of 2 terabyte TF record files with 1024 files, each containing 4000 samples with 256 sample size. Training of this deep learning model runs over 1000 steps with a batch size of 32 kilobytes and reads the data on demand. The last two applications are Deep Learning Climate Segmentation Benchmark and Hamilton Monte-Carlo Simulation. Both applications generate data in memory and hence does not perform any read I/O. In case of Cosmic Dagger, we observed that 22% of the overall time was spent in performing I/O. The dataset is read sequentially with a low aggregate bandwidth of 11 megabytes per second. This low bandwidth is due to the small transfer size of request, which upon investigation turned out to be the small chunk size of the HD5 file from which the data was read. As shown from the portion of the timeline, only 10% of the overall I/O is overlapped behind the model computation. For DFFN, we see that 18% of the overall time is spent on performing I/O. The dataset is consumed by multiple parallel processes and achieves an overall bandwidth of 11 gigabytes per second. The distribution of transfer size centers at 64 kilobytes for images and 100 bytes for metadata file. There is no overlap between computation and I/O as seen on the timeline on the right. In the Cosmo Flow benchmark, which utilizes TensorFlow data pipeline, we see only 10% of the overall time is spent in I/O. The application runs for 4 epochs and hence reads the 2 terabyte dataset 4 times, with an aggregate bandwidth of 36 gigabytes per second. The data is evenly distributed among all processes of the training as shown on the right. The transfer size of each request is 256 kilobyte, which is the default setting within TensorFlow. The application completely overlaps I/O with the compute except for the first I/O. Out of 23% of the whole input pipeline, 11% of the time is spent in pre-processing in memory. ImageNet benchmark, which is similar to the last Cosmo Flow benchmark, spends 15% of the overall time in I/O. Again, this benchmark is written with TensorFlow data pipeline and reads the dataset on demand based on the number of steps it was run with. Hence, there is a non-uniform distribution of samples read across the files. The aggregate bandwidth produced from reading the TF record files is about 32 gigabytes, which is read using the independent POSIX IO interface. Again, the request transfer size is about 256 kilobytes, which is the default in TensorFlow. Also, we again notice that the IO is completely overlapped with compute except for the first IO. In the Candle application, we see that the data is read from CSV dataset, and the application spends about 36% of the overall time in performing IO. Each process reads the whole dataset row by row with an aggregate bandwidth of 8 gigabytes per second and then runs the training over 60 epochs with the data in memory. Currently, as the dataset is only 700 megabytes, this in-memory data processing is possible. However, as the dataset would grow, this training time would increase, as now the training loop would have to perform out-of-core IO. This would further increase the reading time that is shown on this figure. As each row in this CSV is of 256 kilobyte, we see a constant transfer size of 256 kilobyte within the application. We observe that only a single thread is used for performing IO in the timeline, and there is no overlap between computation and IO in this example. The FRNN application spends 23% of its time in IO. It reads 6 gigabyte dataset using NumPy APIs with an aggregate bandwidth of 28 gigabytes per second. There are two types of request. One is metadata and the other is data. However, the frequency of metadata calls, as shown on the transfer size distribution, dominates within the application. Also, there is no overlap in the application between computation and IO. The last two applications, as discussed before, do not perform any IO. Both these applications generate the reading data in memory. However, they perform periodic checkpoints for the model parameters using the standard stdio interface within TensorFlow. This writes about 4 files in tens of megabytes in size. The overall write time was less than 1% of the overall time, and hence are not considered as bottleneck in these applications. Based on our understanding, a general classification between the 8 applications can be made based on the data formats they use. Cosmic Tagger and DFFN here utilize HDF5. Cosmo Flow and ImageNet Benchmark use TF record, and Candle and FRNN use their own custom CSV and NumPy array formats respectively. We see in general for the HDF5 workflow, they use a large single file with POSIX VFD in HDF5. There is no framework integration within TensorFlow or any other DL frameworks for these data formats. This forces the application developers to manually perform sample shuffling and input pipeline design for their application. This leads to serialization of IO and compute phases as seen in these applications without any possibility of overlap of parallelism. In contrast, the TensorFlow TF record data format is well supported within the framework. They utilize independent IO with proto-buff deserialization for reading sample out of the files. The frameworks themselves support IO and preprocessing parallelism for optimizing the input pipeline, along with other kinds of data optimization such as data compression and prefetching are inbuilt supported. Finally, we observe that the files are completely read sequentially from the file system and are shuffled in memory based on the input pipeline's instructions. For the other types of data types, we observe there is less support for optimization within TensorFlow framework. The IO pattern is completely based on the API used and the application developer's input pipeline logic. Using this classification, we can build a benchmark suite which can accurately represent these 8 applications and others with similar behaviors. The design of our benchmark is on the right. The benchmark can be configured using arguments which configure the internal parameters of the benchmark. During the execution of the benchmark, we have a modular format handler to extend the support to other formats as required. Additionally, we support fine-grained profiling within the benchmark for better understanding the behavior of each of the running workloads. Finally, the support for data generation so that we can emulate data scaling tasks for our applications. The DLIO benchmark in its current state supports the following configurations as shown on the left. For the interfaces, it supports TF record, HDF5, CSV, and NumPy arrays. It also supports different file access patterns such as shared or multiple files with independent or collective I/O based on the support of the interfaces. We can emulate different dataset reading patterns such as sequential or random based on the supported interfaces. Also, we have 2 types of I/O in the benchmark. The first is the standard dataset reading, and the second is the model jump pointing over n steps of computation. Finally, we can tune the request size distribution within our benchmark for interfaces. Let's look at the evaluations next. We use a similar setup as before for our methodology on Theta supercomputer. The workload we use in these tests are DLIO benchmark for regression testing and scientific AI applications as discussed before for measuring the impact of our optimizations using DLIO. In the first set of tests, we want to perform a similarity analysis between our benchmark and the deep learning applications we learned in this work. We observe that in general, we can get close to actual applications behavior with a small variance of 6%. This variance is because we use a median of all request sizes instead of a complex distribution that the applications have. This is done for simplicity and better understanding of the benchmark. Then we used our microkernel of Cosmo flow application within DLIO benchmark and tried different optimizations available on the TensorFlow framework, such as transfer sizes, read parallelism, and pre-processing parallelism. We measure the ideal parameters for each of these cases and then directly apply them to the real application on the right. We observe that our DLIO benchmarks results are consistent with the optimization benefits we see on the application themselves. Similarly, we test Cosmic Tagger using DLIO by changing chunk sizes and using different compression methods, and observe that we can transfer these improvements back to the real application using these optimized techniques from DLIO. Finally, as most applications today use small datasets, we generated big datasets with the same pattern utilizing the DLIO benchmark's data generation module. Then we ran strong scaling tests for these applications. The complete set of results are in the paper. However, I would like to highlight 2 of them. The application on the left is the ImageNet benchmark, which uses multiple TF record files within the application. In this, we see that the TensorFlow framework can efficiently provide good I/O performance as the scale increases. This is because TF records are well integrated within the framework. Whereas on the right, we have a shared file application or TFFN, which uses HDF5, which is not well integrated within TensorFlow. In this case, we see that as we increase the scale, the I/O performance suffers and becomes suboptimal. In summary, in this work, we have demonstrated several deep learning applications at ALCF. Also, we have shown through our benchmarking test, we observed that we need a better support for scientific data formats in deep learning frameworks for better exchange. Thank you for your attention. Please email me questions at hdevrajan@hawk.iit.edu. This concludes the presentation. Thank you.